Good evening and welcome to the Ford Hall Forum. I'm Margot Stage, host and producer of Arts and Ideas on WGBH Radio. WGBH is delighted to be here with the Ford Hall Forum, co-sponsoring this mini-series called WGBH in Person. And I'm especially honored to be here tonight to introduce Charlayne Hunter-Gault, the groundbreaking journalist who has both informed and inspired so many of us. First, a few bits of business. Charlayne Hunter-Gault's talk will be followed by a question and answer session, and we'd like you to please go to the microphone here in the center of the hall so that everyone can hear you, and also because this program is being recorded for later broadcast. Ms. Hunter-Gault's new book of her memoirs called In My Place will be on sale after her talk at the back of the hall, and she'll also be signing books over here, I think at this table, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not sure I have all my logistics exactly right, but we'll make sure you know where everything's happening as we go along. If you're a member of WGBH or the Ford Hall Forum, you'll receive a 10% discount on the cost of the book by presenting your membership card. I'd like to let you know that this is the last program of Ford Hall Forum's fall series, and the spring series will begin in late March. In the meantime, telecasts of this program and previous forums can be seen on Boston Neighborhood Network, which is cable channel 3 at 8 p.m. on Saturday evenings. If you'd like to receive the Ford Hall Forum's brochure, fill out the bottom of the questionnaire you received when you entered the hall and give it to a Ford Hall Forum usher or staff member. There's also space on the questionnaire for you to suggest future speakers, and those suggestions are welcomed and appreciated, so please feel free to share your ideas. We also hope that you'll take this opportunity to join the Ford Hall Forum as well as become a member of WGBH, and you can do both those things, again, at the table on your way out. And now, the person we all came to listen to. Charlayne Hunter-Gault started breaking barriers in 1961 when she was one of the first 2 black students admitted to the all-white University of Georgia. And despite firecrackers, bricks thrown through her windows, riots, tear gas, and any other number of things, she graduated in 1963 with a degree in journalism. She began her career at The New Yorker, worked at Transaction Magazine, WRC-TV in Washington, D.C., and The New York Times. Then in 1978, Ms. Hunter-Gault joined the McNeil-Lehrer Report as the first black woman ever to anchor a newscast. She's currently the New York-based national correspondent for the NewsHour and has received numerous rewards for her outstanding work from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, American Women in Radio and Television, several Emmy Awards, and a George Foster Peabody Award. So please join me in welcoming Charlayne Hunter-Gault.
Thank you very much. I've heard so much about the audiences at this forum, and I am not one of these blasé, cynical journalists. I'm so excited I can hardly speak. That people would come out to, I'm sort of used to this with McNeil-Lehrer, but this is, as I said just before I came over, this is my latest baby. My daughter is 29, although she keeps telling me to stop telling people that because she wants to play me in my teenage years. And I said, well, that's awfully optimistic of you to think that anybody would be interested in buying this book. But she's 29, don't tell her I told you. My son is 20, and this is my new baby. And truly, I am as excited about it as either of the other two. I think probably many of you, at least I hope some of you, know me in my present incarnation as national correspondent for McNeil-Lehrer. I will be asking for your prayers and your support as I depart on Sunday evening for Somalia. I had to figure out how to tell my mother that I was going to Somalia, and you know, so don't tell her either that you know something she doesn't know. She's sort of used to this in a sense, although I think she feels that each of my journalistic adventures gets a little more dangerous. I have to say I'm a little bit wary about this one since there's no government in Somalia. But at any rate, most of you, if you have followed the program, know that I do get to travel all over the world, and what you may not know is that it is the absolute fulfillment of a dream. The prologue to my book quotes Zora Neale Hurston from one of her books about one of her characters, Janie, who she says had been getting ready for her great journey to the horizons in search of people. And it was important to all the world that she should find them and they should find her. Now, as you know, I've had many opportunities to find people all over the world and talk with them. Often when they weren't talking with each other, they would talk to me. And while I know that I'm supposed to be here tonight to talk about my new book, my new baby, and on one level, it's not about any of my current exploits and adventures and even misadventures. That's a book for another time, maybe after a few people have died. Because I do try to write an honest book. But in a real sense, what I do today is directly influenced by the story I tried to tell in my place, because it was in the crucible of the civil rights movement and through the prism of that struggle that I have viewed the world and its myriad challenges for the past 30 years, from the struggle of the South of my birth and my personal struggle to South Africa and the struggle of the children of apartheid, to whom this book is also dedicated, the last to take their place, and we all have great hopes that it will be real soon. It was indeed as the South struggled over my place and that of all people of color that I think the South and the nation witnessed one of the single most clarifying moments the country has ever known, where there was a clear definition of what was right and what was wrong, what was moral and what was just, what was fair and what was equal, and it was not to be found in separate. The election notwithstanding and how you may feel about the outcome, given the political atmosphere that had developed in this country through this campaign, I think it's conceivable that one could forget a time when there was a consensus about certain values. I hope that my book will in some small way be a reminder, and that it can in some small way put to rest an axiom an old professor of mine was fond of, which was that we learn from history, that we do not learn from history. In this moment where there continues to be an undercurrent of discussion about values, a lot of it, I think, disingenuous, let me hasten to say that I think there is a lot to be said about values, and in the end, I think that's what my book turns out to be. I tried to define and spell out as clearly as I could the values that informed me and my generation, and the values that have informed me for all of my professional life. In My Place is a personal memoir that takes sort of as its point of departure the desegregation of the University of Georgia and my role in it. As many, if not all of you know, my high school classmate Hamilton Holmes and I were not the first blacks to apply to a state institution, but when we did, we went farther than anyone else had. And I think the brief prologue to the book provides the backdrop to the story. It says, on January 9th, 1961, I walked onto the campus at the University of Georgia to begin registering for classes. Ordinarily, there would not have been anything unusual about such a routine exercise, except in this instance, the officials at the university had been fighting for 2.5 years to keep me out. I was not socially, intellectually, or morally undesirable. I was black, and no black student had ever been admitted to the University of Georgia in its 176-year history. Now, the case and its briefly violent aftermath, read riot outside of my dormitory, are the centerpiece of In My Place. The book is really the story of all of the forces that developed and nurtured and sustained me during that very intense time. I had so much fun the other day with in a conversation with the man who called me from the plane and said that I said, "Where are you?" And he said, "I'm in the plane." And I said, "Well, where are you going?" And he said, "I'm on the way to Little Rock." And I said, "Well, did you see the review of my book in the New York Times on Sunday?" And he said, "I did." And I said, "Did you see those 5 little black fingers around my arm that were disembodied from the body?" Because there was just a picture of me going into the University of Georgia with a couple of students behind me, and you could see these fingers. He said, "Yes." I said, "Well, do you know those were your fingers?" Do you know who it was? It was Vernon E. Jordan Jr. Vernon E. Jordan Jr., as he used to say in his vita, when I was working for the New York Times, I got a call from one of my colleagues who said, "Vernon Jordan just been appointed to head the United Negro College Fund." I said, "Yes." He says, "Oh, I'm doing the story." And I said, "Yes." He says, "Well, I want to check a fact here." I said, "Well, if I can help." He says, "Well, it involves you." And I said, "Well, what does it say?" It says he used his body as a shield to protect you going into the University of Georgia. Well, now, if you look at Vernon E. Jordan Jr. today and you see this very strong body of his, you say, well, that was a pretty good body to use as a shield. But as I am fond of telling him, you weren't as handsome in those days as you are today, and you weren't nearly as strong. Vernon was about this big. But at any rate, he was a young law clerk, and I also remind him, I said, "You may not remember this, but you were making $35 a week in those days, and you had a wife and child to support." But he also had a vision of the South that he wanted to live in, which is why he had gone to Howard University Law School to study civil rights law and had come home to practice civil rights law. And if this country perhaps had gotten its act together a lot sooner, Bill Clinton might be the chairman of the transition team and Vernon Jordan might be president. At any rate, this book is about values and the people who passed on values in a way. If someone says to me, was there anything about the book that surprised you once you had done it? And I said, yes, in a sense, because while I guess the way in which these values were passed along were instinctive, and I absorbed them instinctively, it wasn't until I had actually sat down and written this book that I put my finger on a lot of things. For example, my father was a career Army officer, one of the first and few black officers in the then segregated Army. And that became his obsession, serving in 2 wars and helping his men, the black soldiers, prove themselves in combat. Despite his frequent long absences, the forcefulness of his personality was such that he didn't have to be there. In fact, it used to, can you say piss me off on cable television? Can you? It really used to get on my nerves. I mean, my father would be gone all this time, and my mother would tell me, now get your lessons because your father's going to be coming home, and you want to show him your report card, and you want to be proud. And I would get my lessons and have my report card. My father would come home after being gone for 9 months or 12 months, and I'd have these report cards, and I'd have 4 A's and a B+, and my father would look sternly at the report, and I would expect a smile, and he'd look at me and he'd say, well, what is this B+? I don't understand this here, you know? And I didn't realize till I became such a workaholic at McNeil-Lehrer just what impact that had on me. Never satisfied with an interview, even if it's an A+, which is rare. But I'm always looking, because I always hear my father in the back of my head saying, what is this B+? But that helped to shape my character from a very early age. My mother and grandmother brought up the rear, providing an environment that supported me in almost everything I did, almost, because those of you who are familiar with preachers' children know that they are the absolute worst in the whole congregation. And we used to go to church every Sunday, and I'd sit there and I'd squirm as a little kid. My mother would reach down and pinch my arm. And, you know, when that didn't work, she'd pinch again. And after 4 or 5 pinches, she would very sweetly, so the congregation wouldn't be aware that she was threatening me for dear life, she would say, we're going to have some peach tree tea when we get home. And, of course, I knew that meant that I had to march straight through my house upon arrival, right into the backyard, and rip off of the branch of the peach tree a switch, which would be the peach tree tea that would be administered. The other day I was telling this story somewhere, and in the, please don't do this in the question and answer session, someone came up and said, now, do you describe that thing about peach tree tea, do you think that in this current environment that would be called child abuse? I said, well, I would certainly hope not, because it was administered with a great deal of love, and those of you who read the book will see that it was very painful to my mother, who was doing all of this by herself. Now, I have to say also that if my mother were accused of child abuse, God knows what would have happened with the rest of the neighbors, because it was an environment in which they too, my neighbors, and my teachers at school and at Sunday school all had authority without consultation to administer reward or punishment, and they sometimes did, although basically I was a good little girl. The book was full of so many surprises as I looked for values, and sometimes stumbled across things that I didn't anticipate. Like, I found myself once in the middle of the Great Migration from when blacks left the South en masse to go north. And in my own head, I had always assumed that it was for the reasons that Florette Henry calls in her book, The Great Migration, the devil in the white man. I thought they just were trying to get away from these southern races. But in point of fact, they were leaving in the main, although there was an element of that in some of the flight, but in the main, they were leaving for better economic opportunities. Detroit hadn't become Motown yet. That was for my generation, but it had become the Motor City, and it was offering a whole new level of economic involvement and opportunity. But what's interesting is that my grandparents were such Southerners that once they got to Detroit, even though there was opportunity for a better life, they missed the Southern lifestyle. They missed not being able to walk down the street and have people say, how do you do? And they missed the good part of the South that we want to preserve, that we still try and preserve. And so they came back. But that was a wonderful, wonderful little digression, although it wasn't quite a digression. I mentioned my father about the role that he played in, and somebody asked me about role models, and I guess in a sense that while I had fantastic women role models, my father was a tremendous role model. He had died by the time I wrote this book, and so I had to recreate much of the experience that he went through, at least the specific aspects of his service, although I certainly remember the impact he had on me. And I managed to find a chaplain once, well, several Army people who were about, well, they were a little bit younger than he, because he was much older than most when he went into the military. There weren't many black officers at the time. And they were so excited about their story being told that many a night I used to sit up on the third floor in my office space. My husband had evicted me because I had too many papers scattered around the room for his, to his liking. So I was up there, and at, I don't know, midnight, when, because most of these men are still very active in their communities. They're in their 70s, and they're volunteering at the colleges and teaching here and teaching there. And they would tell me these incredible stories and help me in many ways recreate that experience. And once I found this man who told me that there they were in Korea, and our morale was very high, thanks in part to people like your father. He was always very upbeat. Everything was going to be okay. Things were going to get better. He loved the soldiers, and they loved him. They had problems. They went to see Chaplain Hunter, because all of the, in the segregated army, all of the officers over the black soldiers were white. So the only person that they could relate to who looked like them was the chaplain. Far away from home, wives screwing off, soldiers were getting letters saying, I want a divorce and all this. No matter what was going on, the first thing a soldier wants to see is the chaplain. And I found this one man. I said, well, do you remember any of the things that he used to say, or any of the things that he did? And one man related something. He said, but I know a guy who kept a diary, and if I can track him down, I'm going to see, because he was in Korea about the same time your father was. And a few days later, in the mail, I got this Xerox copy. A Chaplain Hunter came to visit our unit today, wrote Lieutenant Percy Roberts in his diary. He preached a two-fisted sermon that made us all feel good. Chaplain Gray Johnson was there too. He later told me about the soldiers. They were just babies, many of them, and they'd be in a line, firing shoulder to shoulder. I would see 5 or 6 laid out there dead that I knew, like the lieutenant that went by, and I said, I'll see you tomorrow. And tomorrow never came for him. When you're going through it, your mind is as tight as a drum. You don't want to make wrong moves. Too many people depending on you. But I got to the point where I couldn't go to a briefing. I couldn't stand it. Black men dying in the service of a country that didn't give a damn about them back home. I'm not a pacifist, but I just got to the point where I couldn't stand it. I think it was a conflict unique to chaplains like me, like your father. Sometimes back home, I would get a glimpse of the pain my father silently suffered. He would be preaching a guest sermon on Sunday morning and would bring the battlefield into the pulpit. He talked of the time he was running through the rice paddies, fleeing the enemy, running past a mortally wounded young soldier who asked to be turned over before he died, and stopping to turn him over and taking out the Bible and reading to him, I am the way, the truth, and the life. He that believeth in me, the works that I do shall he do also. I go and prepare a place for you, that where I am, there ye may be also. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. In the rice paddy in a far-off land, a soldier dying for freedom, democracy, fighting for a country that back home still kept him in his place, but fighting and dying for the ideal of American freedom and equality, if not for himself, then maybe for his children or the chaplains. I was the chaplain's child, of course, and I benefited from that struggle. Same time, my grandfather was also a preacher, kind of a different kind of preacher, and I knew that I had inherited a lot of my values from him. But he too was dead, and I had to recreate from memory a lot of things. And I used to go around, for a long time before I decided to write this book, I remember seeing a magazine cartoon once. And there was a man sitting on the examining table, stripped to his waist, and the doctor was looking at him, and he had this strange thing coming out of his head, like his head was swollen, but in a very peculiar formation. And the doctor was saying to him, "So tell me, how long have you had this book in your head?" So I think that long before I ever decided to finally write this book, I had this book in my head. And so I used to just collect little things whenever the opportunity presented itself, although I was in total denial. I will never write a book. Calvin Trillin wrote the definitive book about this, Education in Georgia. I don't need to do it. Anyway, I ran into this, I was in Lusaka, Zambia at a conference, and I saw this AME bishop. And I walked over to him and I said to him, I wanted you to know that I'm a daughter of the AME church. And I said, I want to introduce myself to you. And he says, yes, I know who you are. And you know how you are when you work in television, you think people know who you are because you work in television. And he said, I said, you know who I am? And he says, yes. And I said, well, I'm a daughter of the AME church. And he said, that's what I know. He said, I knew your father and your grandfather. Boing. So I said, have you got a few minutes? And I had a friend there with a tape recorder, which I borrowed, and I took him to my room and kidnapped him from the meeting for the next 2 hours. And he told me, his name was Bishop Chappelle, and he told me that he was from Florida, where my grandfather was from, and that my grandfather was a legendary figure, one of the great preachers of his day. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said he was a preacher's preacher. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? And he says, well, the phrase we use in the church is that he could tell a story. He was a preacher's preacher. He could tell a story. They would come from miles around to hear Shep Hunter preach. The difference between my father and grandfather as preachers was that my father was a minister, more cerebral, less theatrical. In the pulpit, my grandfather was as dramatic looking as he was dramatic. 6 feet tall, medium frame, with smooth blue-black skin, accentuated by his completely bald head and Ipana white teeth. He would be in the pulpit like this, and he would get wound up during a sermon, and then he would crouch low, and he would run from one side of the pulpit to the other, back and forth in a frenzy of preaching and singing that would rock the building from the foundation to the rafters. I got 2 wings to fly across Jordan. He would half sing and half shout as he shot across the pulpit, and the world can't do me no harm. He would sing, got 2 wings to veil your face, and some sister somewhere back in the congregation would sing, Jesus, 2 wings, 2 wings, 2 wings. Once Papa was on a roll, he could go for hours and no one would think about leaving. He used to preach the sermon of dry bones about from the passage from Ezekiel where the children of Israel wandering and got stuck in the valley and started to die and their bones were rotting and rusting. And he would talk about, well, different preachers would use this passage to preach different messages. And my grandfather's message was that no matter how low down you sank in life, you could always rise up like the dry bones. And he would talk about the bones disconnected and lying in the dust, and then he would work into the gestures and the bones would begin to click, and then that old black spiritual, he'd start to sing the ankle bone connected to the leg bone connected to the knee bone, and on until the whole body was back together. And Papa would then say, now hear the word of the Lord, and he would start them bones, them dry bones. Well, on one particular steamy hot Florida Sunday, as we sat in the back of the church, sweating and fanning with the paper fan supplied by somebody or other's funeral home, my grandfather was on one of his rolls. He had reached a crescendo and seemed to be winding down several times, only to rev back up again as if the spirit had told him to keep on connecting them bones, or whatever. At one point, my grandmother said quietly, I wish Papa would look at his watch, whereupon I stood up in the back bench of the church and yelled, Papa, look at your watch. Papa heard me, looked at his big, wide, beautiful grin, and paused for a moment. I guess it is about that time, baby, he said. But instead, he used the pause to pull out his white handkerchief and mop his shiny, wet brow, and then proceed to preach for at least another 30 minutes. My grandmother sat there with a beatific smile on her face, but I could hear an occasional sigh. Now, my grandparents were a real team, and I think that here again, I learned so much, even though I was squirmy and wanted Papa to look at his watch. I think that much of the faith that I developed in people used to say to me, well, weren't you scared when you went to the University of Georgia? I mean, didn't you think they were going to hurt you or harm you or kill you? And in fact, my mother told People magazine this week that she was afraid I was going to be killed, something she never told me at the time. And I never this was one of the surprises that the book revealed to me, because I knew that I truly was not afraid, but I never knew why. And I think that one of the reasons why is because of the faith that my grandfather and grandmother taught us all in those church services and in the home that we should have in people. Now, sometimes people didn't always live up to that trust and confidence, but most of the time that they did. I mean, my grandmother was more of a saint than my grandfather in a way, and she would go to church every day, and she would teach me little Bible verses. And one of the ones she used to teach me was, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil," from the 23rd Psalm. And I don't know, that just sort of always stayed inside me. And as I began to recreate their lives, I began to see why I had no fear. The other thing about education, I mean, there was such a love and appreciation for education with all black families, and my family was no exception. My father was born when my grandmother was 14. And she had not had much of a life at that point, and she had my father and then my uncle. And I went to talk to my uncle about that, and to talk to him about where this love of education and values, how that manifested itself with them. And my uncle Ted told me, and I took him aside with the tape recorder too, he said education was important because my daddy made it important. Get an education, boy. That's going to be your salvation. And it extended to all of us, including Mama, he said. We went to the same school, my mother, my daddy, my brother, and me, all at the same time. My daddy was going to Edward Waters College to take up theology. It went all the way from kindergarten up, and we started going there too. Mama was a second grade student. I was in 4th grade, said my uncle. Mama learned to read and write right there. Daddy would come home and ask questions, and we'd all try to answer as best we could. And Mama would be there too, asking questions just like a little kid. So I said, well, Uncle Ted, weren't you embarrassed that you were in elementary school and your mother was there too, and she was in a grade even lower than you? He said, boy, I thought it was the greatest thing in the world for the 4 of us to be going to school at the same time. Everybody loved it. So those values were transmitted because here was my teenage grandmother. And you know, today we worry that teenagers are having babies, and we should worry about that. But we should also be aware from the fact of what our history teaches us that these values are there even with teenagers if they have had a source of values as well. I had fun for a good part of this book because despite the wretchedness of segregation, black people in my life did everything they could to insulate us, their children. And while segregation in a sense defined our legal place, it was the word and example of people like my grandmother and like my grandfather that took us to another place. The chapter Due West of What, which is the first chapter of the book, hopes to put to rest forever the question of my birthplace, because you ask a Southerner, any Southerner, where he or she is from, and no matter how many places they've lived, they will always take you all the way back to where they were born, and I'm no exception. So I always say, well, I live in New York, but but I was born in Due West, South Carolina, and people invariably say, due west of what? Well, the book is going to put that to rest, and I'm not going to read that to you. You can find it out for yourself if you're interested enough. But what was important about Due West, South Carolina, in the early 40s was, it wasn't just Due West, it was the environment, but there was a preacher there by the name of Reverend Glover, who had been sent away from his home in nearby Promised Land and had returned to Due West after training in theology up north at Wilberforce, Ohio. In the late 30s, the Reverend Glover attempted to register at the Abbeville County Courthouse. As recounted in Elizabeth Rao Bethel's Promised Land, he said the clerk administered the literacy tests required by the 1895 state constitution, and Glover, literate in 3 languages, easily read and interpreted the passages from the Constitution as they were presented to him. The clerk had no guidelines for such a situation and quickly conferred with other officials, leaving Glover on the bench in the courthouse corridor. The clerk returned and dismissed Glover with a simple and final decision: "I just can't register you." There was no additional explanation. Glover left the courthouse quietly but filled with deep emotion. The following Sunday, he rose to his pulpit in Due West and talked about black people registering to vote and the unfairness of the Abbeville courthouse experience. Such episodes drew the attention of whites, including the Ku Klux Klan, and there's a terrible story in here about what happened to Glover one afternoon when the Klan took him out and did all kinds of terrible things to him and left him for dead in the woods. But the Reverend Glover survived. His assailants, all known in nearby Promised Land, were never brought to justice. It was the seeds of such experiences, as shared from the pulpit of my mother's church, that were sown in her consciousness as I lay developing in her womb. It would be a generation before they made a difference, a generation after the morning of February 27, 1942, in a bedroom of the small, unpainted frame house that was within an eye shot of the church. My mother lay suffering perhaps the greatest pain she had ever known. Labor started on Wednesday, and by Friday there was still no sign that I was ready to enter the world. Dr. Presley, who had been stopping by daily and who probably didn't want to work on the weekend, told my mother she was going to have that baby that day, come hell or high water. She vaguely remembers that he gave her something, and for the next several hours he worked and worked, trying to maneuver my head out, alternately inserting a pair of metal clamps and then his hands. Despite her own pain, my mother remembers screaming for the doctor to stop mashing the baby's head. You know, people in New England don't use that phrase, but down south, you know, you're going to mash it to death, she said. When I finally did emerge, she said the sides of my head were bruised from the imprint of the clamps, and the space on my forehead between my eyes was red from the apparent pressure of a thumb. My head was so ill-formed, now don't look, because it got fixed. Then, that for days my mother and Aunt Jenny took turns massaging it, trying to get it back to its original round shape. But I cried spontaneously, all 9 pounds of me. And despite the fact that I was not the boy my mother had been anticipating, she felt herself the luckiest woman in the world. What's interesting about South Carolina at that particular time was that about, just a few miles away from Due West, there was a man named the Reverend J.A. Delane and a group of black parents, including Henry Briggs, a black mechanic who petitioned their local all-white school board for a bus because the black children had to walk so far beyond the white schools way into the country to get to school. And the school board foolishly turned them down, thinking that that would be the end of it. But the Reverend Briggs went back, and at that time, the school board, after the school board turned them down, he went back and asked not just for a bus, but for school building, services, and education equal to whites. It would be the first in a long series of steps that would lead to the United States Supreme Court decision that not only outlawed such segregated and unequal school systems, but provided still another road leading me to my place in American society. As many of you know, it was in 1954, finally, that decision was handed down. And as many of you also know, it would be several years before the decision would be implemented. There would be attempts in Alabama with Arthur and Lucy. There would be other attempts. But Hamilton and Holmes and I made the first successful attempt in the South to, other than Little Rock, but at higher education, to implement the decision. But in 1954, ironically, I ended up at a white school. My mother had, by this time, moved us to Atlanta, anticipating my father's return from some tour of duty or other. And we had moved into a neighborhood where it was a white neighborhood, And once a black family moved in, all of the whites moved out, leaving us this incredibly beautiful park. I never could understand how they could leave such a wonderful place, but we were happy to have it. And at the top of the park was this beautiful school. And I had spent the entire summer in anticipation, sort of guarded anticipation of going to this white school. Of course, once I had climbed the hill and walked through the doors for the first time, there was nothing white in sight, only the ghost whites that I conjured up as I climbed the stairs to my classroom and I sat down in one of their seats for the first time. It was a strange experience being in one of their schools. It even smelled different, not better or worse, just different. At first, we all thought the tall, willowy principal, a Miss Post, was white, but it turned out she was not. Probably had the same great-grandfather I did. About the only thing the whites had left was the school name, Frank L. Stanton. He had been the poet laureate of Georgia. The school song, Sweetest Little Feller, was adapted from the poem of the same name, and we all had to sing it at assembly programs. At first, none of us wanted to learn this white song, especially with all the dialect, which seemed to mock us. But the teachers said we had to learn it, and in time, lacking any alternative, we came to sing it as our own, including this verse. Looking at his mammy, with eyes so shiny blue, make you think that heaven is coming close to you. We were supposed to sing that with pride. I was there the other day when we launched the book in Atlanta, and I remembered this part of my experience at Frank L. Stanton. And as I was leaving, the assembly was still in session, and they said, well, Mrs. Hunter-Gault, we can think of no more fitting departure for you than for us to sing the new school song. And you talk about dancing in the streets and in the aisles. Aretha Franklin had nothing on that crowd with that new school song. The Civil Rights Revolution came to Atlanta when Hamilton and I applied. As I said, it would take more than a year and a half for us to finally exhaust all of the remedies we had before taking the state of Georgia to court. And in the meantime, the movement towards freedom and dignity was spreading throughout the South, and the Atlanta student movement would begin a series of direct action protests aimed at desegregating all of the places of public accommodation in the city. And my two best friends, who had been my buddies and the two girls that I did everything with, much of which is unmentionable, would be in the forefront of it, something different for them. They would march and demonstrate and go to jail. And that was another attempt that I made in the book to try and put what Hamilton Holmes and I did into some context, because the other reason I think that we were not afraid was that we were not alone. The students, a handful of them, including Julian Bond, who many of you know from Georgia, the Georgia legislature, who's now a professor of history in Washington, D.C. at a university, were just young college kids who got together and wrote this incredibly beautiful document called the Committee on Appeal for Human Rights, calling on the white, what we used to call in the South in those days, the white power structure, to meet these demands. On the day the document was published, March 9, 1960, Carolyn told me she put on her best Sunday clothes, including high heels. You know, in the South, we always dressed to the nines, no matter what, if it was something important. And a demonstration was important, so we wore high heels. And along with Wilma and many of the 4,000 students of the Atlanta University Center colleges marched through the streets of Atlanta saying, in effect, our time has come. A week later, fanning out to places of public accommodations and facilities supported by tax dollars, the students held their first sit-in. Their goal was to draw attention to their demands and to get arrested in order to make cases that would challenge the Jim Crow laws that sent us to separate colored water fountains, that sent us to separate colored toilets, or that kept us from eating at all. Eventually, it would include places like the Fox Theater, a movie house designed like a medieval castle. There were over 100 stone steps winding up the outer wall leading up to the tower. That's where they made the black folks sit. Many a time I remember going with my mother to the Fox, and while I don't remember any of the movies I saw there, I shall never forget the stairs. One of the main stores that we targeted was Rich's, the multi-story, moderate to upscale department store where most of Black Atlanta shopped. In those days, blacks may not have always liked the treatment they got, but they had no options. In addition to all of the other memories now about the subtle and not so subtle indignities blacks suffered at Rich's, I remember once suggesting to my mother that she go to Rich's and get her hair done. It was long and straight, and about all that she could do was wrap it in a ponytail or a bun. I wasn't suggesting that she try to pass. I was merely telling her that was as fair as she was, I was sure she could go and no questions would be asked. My mother's reaction was typical of an attitude all over the black community at the time. "Oh no," she said without bitterness, "I'm not going down there and take the chance they'd find out I was a Negro and let them burn up my hair." But something had now changed in Atlanta, and something had changed in us. We had been protected and privileged within the confines of our segregated communities, but now that we students had removed the protective covering, we could see in a new light both our past and our future. We could see that past, the slavery, the segregation, the deprivation, and the denial for what it was, a system designed to keep us in our place and convince us somehow that it was our fault as well as our destiny. Now, without either ambivalence or shame, we saw ourselves in a new light. We saw ourselves as the heirs to a legacy of struggle, but struggle that was, as Martin Luther King was teaching, ennobling. Struggle that was enabling us to take control of our destiny. And as a result, we did not see ourselves or the other young people demonstrating in one way or another throughout the South as heroes to be praised, celebrated, or fretted over. We were simply doing what we were born to do. While not everybody in the adult black community was on board, the Atlanta student movement had spoken in terms that became the watchwords for all of us. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me round. There followed the dramatic unfolding of Georgia's last massive resistance stand. I spoke about the riot outside my dormitory, encouraged by the highest levels of state government. The assistant to the governor called the students at the law school and encouraged them to organize the riot, which they were happily obliging about. Within days, though, we were suspended after the riots, but in days we were back with armed guards and with a new determination to see it through to the end. But not before the campus police apprehended a man found wandering near my dormitory room looking for me. He was carrying a gun. He was recommitted to the insane asylum. Sometimes more than one new determination was necessary, but you will have to read the book for those details. The impetus for my writing this book was in part the result of my returning to the university after 25 years, invited as the first black person to address a graduating class, a dubious distinction at best, but one I decided to accept. I could almost reach out and touch the history that I felt that day coming full circle. And I felt at that point that maybe I was old enough, if not wise enough, to put together some honest reflection of those times. I'm glad I waited this long. Suffice to say that when I returned 25 years later and confronted that graduating class, most of what was on my mind that day was memory. Memory that 25 years ago, as I said, and the end of the book is that chapter, that graduation speech. Memory that 25 years ago, a watch fire was lit A watchfire celebrating the revelation that amid misunderstanding and confusion and hate, the simple good fortune of one curious, inquisitive black girl who dreamed of being Brenda Starr and found the University of Georgia the place to fulfill that dream, and one gifted young black man who wanted to be a healer could be attained. It is my hope that in writing this book, In My Place will keep that watchfire burning among those of us who are committed, remain committed to struggle, because I find joy in struggle. I wish we didn't have to struggle, but human nature being what it is, we probably will always struggle, and so therefore I have chosen to think of it as a positive virtue. That those of us who are committed to struggle on every level for full equality and rights for all people regardless of race or creed or gender or sexual orientation, that we will feel encouraged that our struggles produce something concrete, and that we should be encouraged by that even though we haven't reached the point where we would like to be. That those of you who read this book might feel in some small way that you can also help to keep that watchfire burning. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Charlayne. Clearly, it's our great pleasure to hear you tonight and to have you here with us in Boston. You're invited to come up to the microphone and ask questions.
You talk movingly about role models in your own life, and you speak also of the great richness that exists out there that many people in the majority community are not familiar with. I know it's the McNeil-Lehrer report and not the Hunter-Gault report, but I wonder if you could speak for a moment about the decisions that are made on that show, which is of course one of the most respected shows in the United States today, and all the other shows in which we look night after night at white males representing the only expertise brought before the camera to talk about everything from militarism to child care.
Oh, I think that's changing, though. I mean, if you've watched the program, it hasn't changed to the extent that any of us would like, but there is a consciousness there that has been brought to bear since the day I came, certainly, and it has continued. I mean, I was chosen because I was a woman, so there is a consciousness going in. The absence of women and minorities is a part of the sort of pattern and practice that goes on in every institution in America. And until conscious women, minorities, and men are in positions of power and influence to change that, it will continue. Now, I think that our program has been, in some instances, justifiably criticized in the past for not having, well, for the white male viewpoint. But Madeleine Albright, just when you mentioned arms control, I was thinking of her as one example. But I have been very pleased to see an increase in the number of women and minorities across the board who are able to talk about something other than, albeit I think it's important for them to talk about the issues that are gender related or color race related. But I think it is also important, as you suggest, that these experts be chosen not just because of their expertise in their obvious field, but in a variety of ones. And I think that's happening. I mean, for some of us, it's not happening fast enough, but it's happening. I mean, it's interesting that Gergen and Shields are two of our most popular analysts and one of our most popular features. And all around the country I've gone, and women have come up to me and said, you know, we'd like to see a woman in that mix. And I have taken this back and said, you know, this is what people have said. So here comes an interesting proposition. So we get a woman in this mix, but right now the mix is conservative liberal. So you put a woman into the mix, can you get one who's right down the middle, or do you have to then add two women? And if you add a white woman, do you have to add a black woman? I mean, you know, which shouldn't stop us from doing it, but it's just part of the deliberation that's going on now. There's not an inhospitable reaction to the proposition. It's just how do you do it and do it fair? I mean, Linda Chavez, of course, is seemingly moving to the center, but she's obviously identified as a conservative and a Republican. Linda Duvall, same. Linda Williams, black female, Joint Center, now University of Maryland, identified with the left. So, you know, that's just one little minor side thing that I find sort of interesting, because I know there's a hospitable reaction to it. But I think that's starting to happen more and more. And, you know, we used to get criticized during the early days of the Reagan administration because we only had, we were criticized for only having Republican conservatives. And Jim Lehrer said, well, hell, you elected them. What are we supposed to do? You know, they are our representatives and they are the people in charge. You want us to change your vote. Well, you all have spoken, you've changed. So now you're going to have Clinton and Gore, and you know, they have said that they're going to, and you see, this is watch this. You heard it here, folks. If Clinton and Gore live up to their promise of having an inclusive, diverse cabinet and government, and really do it in a what's the word I want, somebody, in a meaningful, obvious way, you know, not some subtle thing where you can't tell one way or the other, but really do it, it's going to have an impact. It will have a definite impact on how the rest of America, corporate and in your public institutions and everywhere, because it will be leadership from the top. It will be saying, this is the kind of government we're going to have, because this is, what has he said? He said he wants a government that reflects the country. And so if it happens, it will have an impact. If it doesn't happen, it'll be business as usual. And I think that's his challenge. And your challenge is to keep his feet to the fire.
You already have a line. Thank you all for coming tonight, and thank you, Charlayne Hunter-Gault. The book line has already started forming, so enjoy. Mm-hmm.